Joy to the world. Yeah. Heralded every Christmas season, those words. And that word joy is what I want to explore with you today. It's a big word. For 3 letters, it's a really big word. It's one of the 7 attributes of God. You know, on Christmas Eve, when we do our candlelighting service, we have a candelabra up here that has a peak. And it has 7 places, 7 candles for the 7 attributes. And it starts with peace, power, beauty. And then in the middle, the highest candle is joy, followed by love, light, and wisdom. Joy sits right there at the pinnacle point. It has its special place. And we, even in our community, hold joy as sacred. It's one of our shared values. Again, and they were created in a way so that we were able to put them, they ended up being that way, and so they're actually on the wall in the back of our sanctuary. And joy stands clear as one of the things that we hold as precious. So what is this thing, joy? What do we want to know about it? Well, I did a little research. I looked at how joy is being used in our culture. And what I discovered was, and I kind of knew this, but it was nice to confirm it, that the mental sciences have found a place for joy. Now, the mental sciences, what I'm talking about, psychology, psychiatry, and those sorts of disciplines, have always been focused on our dysfunction, what's wrong with us, and how can we fix what's wrong with us. Sort of like any medical model does, in at least Western approaches to that. And then about 20 years ago, somebody came along that kind of changed the whole focus. His name is Martin Seligman. He is a professor of psychology at the University of Pennsylvania, and he founded the Positive Psychology Center. And there is this new thing called positive psychology. And what it's all about is, instead of finding ways to improve our lives from the dysfunction of all of the mental states that have been identified over the decades, this particular discipline is about making people who are generally functioning okay in society have a better life. What a concept. What a concept that maybe we could actually just give something to everybody to improve. And it has taken off. It's quite amazing how it's taken off. So much so that this whole idea of positive psychology has become this juggernaut of funding in our academic world. In Ivy League schools, in fact, quite a number of major universities around the country, the number one elective taken by students, always more people wanting to take it than can get in, is positive psychology. People wanting to know how to live a more joyous, full, meaningful, rich life. Because they're not. So people are looking at how that works. And I think it was Yale University that recently received a $4.5 million grant at their divinity school to discover how religion and a better life work together. So there are lots of things going on around that. And one of the key focuses of this is, how do we get more joy into our life? So again, that's what I want to talk about this morning. I'm not remembering where we're going. Let's talk about products that are being marketed. Each one of these has an interesting story, actually. The perfume Joy was actually created by a fashion house in Paris in 1929 during the Great Depression. And basically, the fashion house just kind of crumbled because people weren't buying fashions in the middle of a depression. So they decided to come up with a fragrance, and they called it Joy. And it was a major hit. They sold it for $35 an ounce, which today would mean about $700 an ounce, in the middle of a depression. And as the depression was ending and people were moving out of it. And they sold that perfume for decades. Now, Almond Joy was created by a Hershey organization right after World War II, and so was Joy, the dishwashing detergent. They used the word joy believing that it was something that people would be attracted to. And it was, because these were all successful products. The word was also used in publishing. Maybe not as far back. Yeah, well, I think the first one here, The Joy of Cooking, was actually published originally in 1948 by a woman named Irma Brombauer, who was struggling with the suicidal death of her husband, and put together this book and self-published it. And back in 1948, to self-publish meant that she was typing out copies and selling them. And it eventually became a wonderful cookbook. I own one. Now, her daughter, several decades later, redid the cookbook, took out all the sugar and butter and really ruined it. But I believe they sold 18 million copies of that book, The Joy of Cooking. Wow, The Joy of Cooking. And there's another joy book that you probably will remember. This book called The Joy of Sex by Alex Comfort was another big seller. Not quite as many as the cookbook, but about 12 million copies sold around the world, and incredibly successful, and was part of the sexual revolution of our country back in the 1970s. So the word joy has been used successfully for these kinds of things. So the question is, now that it has been used in that way, how do we use this concept of joy? How do we have it in our lives in a way that'll work? Well, the thing is that joy is not something you can go get. You cannot purchase it. You cannot get it, although you can be influenced by others. It has to be a personal choice to be in a state of joy. No one can make us joyful. No one can give us joy and have us be required to accept it. It has to be a choice. It has to be something that we want to be experiencing. And that's an important thing for us to look at. So this whole idea of joy, and I believe that joy is an emotion, and there are lots of words that do the same thing. I did make a list, and then I skipped it. Let me tell you some of the synonyms for joy that some we use, some we don't. Bliss, some people name their dogs after that one. Cheer, chipper, delight, ecstatic, elated, gleeful, happy, jolly, jubilant, merry, rejoicing, and thrilled. And those were just the ones I liked. So we have lots of words for this, which means it's important to us as a culture. But how are we doing as a culture with joy? Well, there's been some studies done, and I want to share some of that with you. Here we are. This comes from a United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network, who studies joy, studies happiness in the world, and ranks countries according to how satisfied their citizens are, how they perceive themselves to be, asking them, well, are you joyful? Do you have a joyful life? And they get answers from 156 nations around the world. Where do you think the United States is on that list? Not too bad. 18th. 18th. And the interesting thing about that is when you look at 1 through 17, they're all relatively small countries, and they do not have diverse populations. They basically have the culture of the people that live there, and nobody else does. And most of them are in the far north, like Greenland and Iceland and Denmark, and places that are particularly cold, where people who live there and who have lived there for many, many, many generations, that doesn't much change. Apparently, it's easier to be joyful that way. Now, the United States doesn't have that. We obviously are a very large country with a lot of people, and we have an amazing amount of diversity, which we're working on. But because of that, apparently, some people don't get all that joyful. Now, I just made note of some of the countries, the other big countries in the world, the first world nations like Japan, who is ranked 62nd, Russia 73rd, and China 94th, again out of 156 nations. So maybe at 18 we're doing okay under the circumstances. So the reason that researchers say that people would say they're not experiencing a great deal of joy is that there's this thing that goes on in the world where people think that if they have too much good, too much joy, then they have to experience the opposite of that in their life in equal measure, which is foolish. But that's what some people think. And I have a great example of it. And you may have heard this story before from me. When I was president of our organization, I traveled over to Eastern Europe. I went to Ukraine. And I had a young, at the time he was probably 18, 19 years old, a young translator named Artum. And Artum followed me around like a shadow so that I could talk to everybody because they all spoke Russian. And on the last day when I'd finished all of our experience together, and it was wonderful, I looked at Artum and he was sad. And I said, "Why are you sad?" And he says, "Oh, all this good that we've had this week, now we have to experience all this bad." And in the moment, I remembered the words of my teacher, Rocking Bear, and I used them on Artum. I said, "Okay, you want to feel bad? I'll absolutely support you in that. I'll see you as miserable, having a terrible time. It'll be awful. Is that what you want?" And he looked at me, kind of sobered up, and said, "Okay, we'll do it your way." Today, young Artum is getting up there in years. He's probably in his 30s by now, and he's married to a former executive from a Hollywood studio, and she has more money than God, and is also a religious science minister, and has retired. She must have been in her 40s when she retired a few years ago. And the guy's got this great life. I'm really glad he did it my way. And his life is filled with joy, as it should be, as all of our lives should be. But it's ours to do that. It's not anybody's job to make us joyful. They can't. We have to choose it for ourselves. So if that's the plan, then we need to be looking at some things about how we can make our lives more joyful. And I think the best way to do that is to give you some ideas on things that you can use in your life. If joy doesn't just come natural to you all the time, the reason is that we all have moments of happiness all the time. Probably just these little snippets of time in our lives where something makes us feel, "Oh, that's nice," something like that. The problem is we don't hang on to those. We just let them fade away real quick. "Oh, okay," and we're back to where we were. Now, I'm not suggesting that other emotions aren't legitimate, that they're not valid. Every emotional state is legitimate. The actual thing of emotions is that it's simply energy. And the only difference between emotions is that they resonate and vibrate at different speeds. So that a fast-moving, vibrating energy would be an emotion that would be light and joyful. Others would be different. They would be heavier, and they would have a reason to be heavy because they are providing us with something that we need in the moment. So I'm not suggesting that any emotions are wrong. Whatever you're feeling, go ahead and feel them. What I'm saying is that this idea of our emotional state is something that we get to choose. I remember once when I was in Australia, I had a difference of opinion with another one of the people on staff in the community where I was, and had been told how wrong I was, which I really never developed much of an ability to deal with that. So it was my night in class where I was supposed to do the announcements. And so I got up, and we did our classes at night, and this was for a very large class, and we did them at the end of the class. So I kind of got up there and started talking, and I was still all beat up about being told I was wrong. And I had this little voice in my head that said, "This isn't working. You need to change right now." So I picked it up, and I went to a place of joy and changed the environment. The whole classroom was different suddenly. That we have that ability to do that. And I had classmates and staff members that later on said to me, "What happened up there?" And this is, of course, the story that I told them. And what I realized, which is what my teacher Ken had been teaching the whole time I was there, is that we're in charge of our experience. Don't rely on anybody else for it. Don't rely on an event to help us be joyful. Just be joyful. And here's why we have to be joyful, is because the emotional state that we're in is essential to the creative ability that we have to create our lives. It's not that if we have heavy energies like being depressed or being angry or being frustrated or anything like that, that we're not creating. We're still creating, but now we're creating with those energies. And what that's doing to us is creating more things that would cause us to be depressed or angry or upset about something. So what happens is that until we make a conscious choice to change our energy and to experience life differently, we're going to stay right there in that muck and mire. And that's not helping. That's not helping anybody, especially us who are going through that. So the idea is that we must be able in a moment to say, this isn't working. I'm changing what's going to work better for me. And then from that place of joy specifically, we're going to create joyous experiences around us. People are going to come up to us happy. Things that happen around us are going to delight us because we've shifted our affect, we've shifted our state, and that makes all the difference on what we experience in life. So this is why we do what we do in this teaching, to create an affect that works for us. There are times when we want to feel those other things, and it's very appropriate, but don't stay there. One thing I learned in doing that work in Australia was that we all have kind of a home base on what's called the emotional tone scale. We have a place we kind of go to. And I'll tell you what, I can't think of a better one than joy, because this idea of joy to me is light without having a lot of effort to it. Being enthusiastic takes a little more effort. Being ecstatic will burn you out. But this idea of being in a joyful state is a gentle, beautiful place to be that resonates with people around us. So how do we get there? What do we do to get there? Guess what? I got me a list. 7 ways to boost your experience of joy. The first way on my list is to be grateful. Just to be grateful. Because when we are grateful, we get more of what we're grateful for. So if we're in a state of joy and we're grateful, even if we're not in a state of joy, and if we can move into a state of gratitude, it will take us to joy. Because we are joyful about the blessings in our lives. We are joyful about the things that we hold as valuable in our lives. And when we remember that, and remember that stuff doesn't really go away. Even when times are tough, the stuff doesn't go away. We just don't think about it. So being grateful causes us to think about things that actually create space in us to really experience that joy. The second one is maintaining meaningful relationships. Wow. I'm so grateful that we get to have the relationships we have in this community. One thing that a lot of people think is that if you're going to have meaningful relationships, you have to have lots and lots of them. You really don't. The researchers say that if you have 2 or 3 important, meaningful relationships with people that you are in regular contact with, it will create an atmosphere in your life of joy, of happiness, of contentment. So it isn't like we have to go really work hard on a lot of relationships. What we need to do is to have a very small, intimate core of people that we can rely on and who can rely on us. And then from that place, we have concentric circles of connections with other people that allow us to bring the joy that we experience in that inner circle into the other relationships in our lives, making them all meaningful. But we don't have to put the same level of work into it that we do in making sure that those close relationships are real quality, that we are communicating well, that we are supportive to one another, and that makes a difference in our lives. So meaningful relationships certainly has its place. Exercising, believe it or not, exercising helps us be joyous. But you'll notice that I've got a picture of a guy walking with his hands in his pockets. Doesn't look like much exercise, huh? Well, actually, the exercise they're talking about could be an hour a week. An hour a week of some vigorous exercise, or 10 minutes a day of just walking. I think it's one reason that Barbara has such a clean, clear affect and spends so much time being in joy, is that she's exercising every day now. She's walking the parking lot when she can, when the weather permits, and she's upstairs doing all kinds of exercises every morning. That's her routine. I think, wow, I see that. When I found this one, I went, yeah, that sounds like Barbara. So we're not talking about rigorous exercise. We're talking about just keeping yourself active and moving is the important thing there. Abundance. I'm like a kid in a candy shop, you know? The biblical phrase, my cup runneth over. Apparently in Barbara's story today, that wouldn't apply. But in normal cases, that's considered something of having great abundance in your life. So the thing to do with abundance is to identify where you're experiencing abundance in your life. And when you experience abundance, it goes hand in hand with joy. So it's not, here's an idea. To create a list of the things that you have abundantly present in your life. All the blessings where you feel like it's not just kind of an average, neutral thing, but you have more than enough. Wow. What a great way to find joy in your life. Adjusting your mindset. And here I am at the beach again, always doing that. We talked about how joy is a choice, and it serves us to have reasons to be delighted about our lives. But we have to make those choices. We have to be the one that accepts that, because there can be joyous things happening around us. And if we're not in a state to receive that and know that, then we won't get it. There's actually a part of our brain that controls memory and controls our affect. And what they have found is that people who are able to adjust their mindset and create a joyous experience in their lives, that part of their brain is larger than someone who is generally depressed. So it is having a direct effect not only in your ethereal mind, but in your physical countenance. When you use joy, your body likes it. Your body excels in states of joy. So adjusting your mindset is a key way to do that. Leaning into your problems. Leaning into your problems. How's that going to help? Well, actually, I think someone can say this way better than I can, and I'm going to use his words. And the reason for the picture of who I think is a whirling dervish is that the one who's going to teach us about this one is named Rumi. And what he writes, a long time ago, is, this being human is a guest house. Every morning, a new arrival. A joy, a depression, a meanness. Some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and attend them all. Even if they're a crowd of sorrows who violently sweep your house, treat them each honorably. He may be there to clean you out for some new delight. The dark thought, the shame, the malice. Meet them at the door laughing and invite them in. Be grateful for whoever comes, because each has been sent as a guide from beyond. Welcome difficulty. Learn the alchemy true human beings know. The moment you accept what troubles you've been given, the door opens. Welcome difficulty as a familiar comrade. Joke with torment brought by a friend. Sorrows are the rags of old clothes and jackets that serve to cover and then are taken off. That undressing and the beautiful body underneath is the sweetness that comes after grief. So don't be afraid of your emotions. Accept them all. Lean into your problems. And see if you don't find joy at the end of that tunnel. And then I think we have one more here. Number 7 is being generous. And that's because most people would try to deal with the idea of being upset or depressed or anything of that sort by trying to grapple with it to get rid of it. Where all you have to do is do something nice for somebody else and see the joy in their heart and bring that into your life. And if you instigate it, that's your joy. So there they are, 7 ideas. Take what you want, leave the rest, and see if there isn't something for you that can bring more joy into your life, but not from outside, from within. So this is our last Sunday of 2020. I don't know anybody that is unhappy with that. But here's the difference. We begin 2021 with the same issues of a pandemic and whatever else you've got in your life that challenges you, but with a different trajectory. We're not at the beginning of a pandemic. We can actually see the end of it. My daughter-in-law, Dr. Bridget, got her first vaccine this past week. And somehow that action for me brought into light that we really aren't going to be doing this all that much longer. There's going to be challenges, of course there are. There's going to be news stories about how something didn't work. I don't care. It's time for us to see the end of this and to move into something that's much more delightful, much more joyous. And with whatever else comes in 2021, I know we'll have our family here together, growing again, being more full than it has been over these past many months. And that will help us all find our way back into the light, to know who we are, to live from this truth, and to create the life that we've come to create. And whatever it is that we're creating, let's do it joyously. I love you very much. Thank you. Yay!